professor of America here at Harvard, with an appointment at the Department of Anthropology. And we are also joined today by Phillip Santos, who is professor of interdisciplinary humanities and a distinguished senior lecturer in the Space of Cultural Studies at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And I will now try to reach out to read us.
Thank you so much for having us. Who else is here from the Rockefeller?
Marcela. I'm in charge of the audio program at the dedicated Center. Carol, the editor of Artista, and I'm always interested in videos.
These are one of the great parts of Harvard as a whole. One time working here, really produce some great literature in the Artista. They feature. So thank you all for coming. If you join us at the table here, there's also some freshmen back here. You can go now and pick some up. Con confianza. So we're during the charla here. So a couple of people I want to thank also wonderful poster created by Citalin. Who also works with me in the Mesoamerican Archive. We want to certainly thank her, Pedro Morales. Here they set up a way for us to film this. Usually this is a course that Pedro and I teach called Latinos Remaking America. Tell me again the subject. Pedro, tell me again the subject.
Immigration. Culture, lives in transition. Lives in transition.
Some of the students who take that class here with us. We'll give everybody a chance to introduce themselves in a moment. There's American Archive, Extension School, part of this evening, and also part of the over in our classroom. We usually meet over in our classroom and show to the extent of students in this class. So we have this manual reading here, and this is going to be filmed and shown to the extension staff. So I'd like John Phillip to feel like he's come multiple communities. He's come to a place more familiar with in terms of who's here. I'd like you to introduce yourself, John Phillip, and to others in the room. Say what you're studying here and how happy you're here to be here tonight. Joe?
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Rosales. I'm at the Community School, and I'm very excited to learn more of your work here and your work here and my culture. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sierra Mesqua. I'm a student from the Carasas class in Bedford. I'm doing a master's in anthropology and archaeology through the Extension School, and I'm here because I want to delve deeper into the cultural rootedness of antiquity and how we find that in the migratory patterns that we see in the border. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for coming. I work at Harvard.
My religion and Latin studies, and I heard a lot about Santos and some of the work before, and I'm really excited to join the conversation.
Can you tell some of the courses you teach here?
I teach classes in next theory, and I Caribbean.
The title of your most recent book?
Poetics of the Flesh.
Hey everyone, I'm Ross. I'm also part of this class, and I am a master's student at the Extension School studying for a government degree. I also work for the university. writer for FAS editorial covering diversity.
Hello, everyone. My name is JPSantosLRA4s. I'm an undergrad student at Extension School, studying anthropology and psychology, and I'm also part of the class. I'm a research assistant in Boston University, one of their chapter development laboratories, and then I also work for Native American Lifeline. Yes, I'm Venezuelan and also.
Hi everyone, I'm Alma and also from the class, and I work at law school on specifically our initiative where we represent students, staff, and faculty of Harvard across schools and also matters.
I am Daria Martinez. I am not from Harvard. I study a master in gender studies in Mexico City at UNAM. And I am here because Jorge invited me.
I'm Jorge. I teach in the history and literature, degrees in history and literature, and I work on Latin American Latin literatures and cultures, and queer and decolonial theories.
I'm Pedro Morales. I teach, co-teach the class Latinos Remaking America with Prof. Carrasco, and I also teach Gen Ed class on the cuisine of Mexico and Quest for Wisdom with the Divinity School, Extension School.
Daniel.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Daniel Dávalos. Yo vengo de la Ciudad de México. Tengo experiencia desde 1985 en comunidades campesinas e indígenas en México. Entonces estamos aquí ahora invitados por Carrasco para colaborar con ellos con esta experiencia.
No sé si hablar en inglés o en español, but anyway, I'm from Mexico City and grew up in Texas. My name is Vanessa. I'm a graduate of the Chancellor of Public Health, and I'm now at the Divinity School doing an MDiv and studying religion, ethics, and politics as it relates to health equity.
Hi everyone, I'm Sikahin, and I'm doing a Master in Theoretical Studies at JPS, and I'm also working with Profe at the Mesoamerican University. And I'm from Mexico.
And I'm from Texas. I've been in Boston for about 5 years, but I go to Mexico most winters and always trying to expand my community while here in Boston.
Hi, I'm Phillip. I am Phillip's boyfriend. So I'm just here.
My name is Alfredo Garcia Garza, PhD candidate in the Committee of Study of Religion, focusing on religion, migration, and violence, and healing in the Rio Bravo borderlands with a focus on it.
Hey everyone, I'm Elias Sanchez. I'm an SJD candidate at the law school, and I'm doing research on race and law in 20th century Mexico, but I'm also interested in the making of racial and ethnic identities.
So Santos.
Oh yeah, my name is Julio Dali. I'm a student at the school looking for ideas to expand our moral imagination in the political conflict in Venezuela. Exploring ideas like forgiveness, making sense of now having this such a migrant community. And I have a class with Prof. Quest for Wisdom.
My name is Chloe Garcia Robertson. I'm the editor of the Harvard Review, and I saw this in Spanish and I'm text
Right place, right time.
My mother's from Dallas and
everybody's welcome. Thank you. Everybody. So John Phillip Santos is here. Yesterday he was in one of those class with Danilo Perez, and they did this wonderful improvisations. And yesterday he really spoke about his own personal story in creating places left unfinished at the time of creation. This book is really one of the most original memoirs ever written by a Latinx person in this country. And it was the finalist for the National Book Award. And Phillip himself was the first Mexican American to be a Rhodes Scholar. And out of that work came this marvelous memoir, followed by a second memoir. The farthest home is in an empire of fire, which is about the Spanish side of the lineage. Followed by another book of poems. I can't give us the title of the book.
Songs older than any known singer.
Yeah, so all of these, and I can tell you the content is as good as the title. He had a long career in New York City and elsewhere as a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. A number of Emmy nominations. Among his travels in Latin America with Father Elizondo was used in well-known relationship with Gustavo Gutierrez, very much animated by Bernardo Boff and the entire heyday of Latin American liberation theology, and how that then stimulated Latino liberation theology or Mexican American liberation theology in the work of Virgilio Elizondo. We really met through Virgilio Elizondo. We both learned from and loved very much. He's spent a number of years at the Ford Foundation, empowering and enabling other people to do their film documentary projects, including, he was crucial in the project I worked on for a long time, the director's cut of Lista, which, by the way, as a result of the support that he raised and the music of Dr. Loco, the Rocking Jalapeno Band, in the new version of that film is now in the Criterion Collection. And it also just went into the National Registry or something. Yeah. And so it was a collaboration with John Phillip, Mexican American musicians, Su Servidor, that led to the revival of one of the great films about migration and the farm workers in the history of the United States, Julia Lucia and Vista, which won the Camera de Oro at the Cannes Film Festival when it first came out. We redid part of it, and it's now part of the National Treasure in films in the United States. So John Phillip is instrumental in that. He's got also a career that is just come out in a new album with Escobedo, you know. And maybe we'll hear some of that today. He's quite a chanter himself, and very, very much also won the Texas Medal of Arts, along with Chris Christopherson. Am I right about that? That's right. Chris Christopherson, Kenny Rogers, and John Phillip Santos. I spent Texas Monthly, some very powerful essays there. So, John Phillip, it's wonderful to have you here again. It's an ongoing relationship that has produced some wonderful stuff. So please welcome John Phillip Santos.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the Center for hosting us and to all of the coalitions that were assembled in the last days to make this visit such an incredible, transcendent moment. Yesterday was incredibly magnifico, and tonight, what I want to do is share some notes. This is more testimonio than treatise, so it's more personal than any sort of edict of any kind. These are reflections on questions kind of relating to the ways that we inquire and describe ourselves. That's what it put it. I wanted to note just this fantastic poster that Sabine did, which would take maybe 10 minutes to really fully do an exegesis on here. The idea of using a coil shellfish as an emblem for a cowboy hat set over the Rio Grande and embedded in the Constitution of the United States. It sort of captures in a synecdoche, much of what I want to try to address today. I am thinking a little bit about just how we do this in terms of addressing the Chicanx. And maybe I'd ask David, is this talking in too rudimentary a way about this topic of Chicanismo and the Chicanx descriptor? So what I want to do is share some notes. We're in the midst in San Antonio right now at the University of Texas, San Antonio, of building a new program in Borderlands Humanities. So a humanities practice rooted in an autochthonous borderland setting. What does it mean to develop that, especially for our students? Preponderantly Chicanx, Chicanoa, well, we'll get into that in a second. But ancestors, I'll do a couple of stories on ancestors, a couple of stories on borderlands, a couple of stories on chronicles and learning, and then we chat. So I'm really eager to hear where y'all are thinking about some of these questions. I can share some notes about where my students are these days on this question. I'm going to largely talk, but intermittently read a little bit. So and I'll start with a little preamble in terms of setting the stage for the delirious plateau of descriptors that we're talking about. We once were Chicanos. We once were Spanish Americans. Pachucos, Americans of Mexican descent. Then Pachucos de la Pachucada, the name that's used for the borderless domain of the Pachuco. Then Americans of Mexican descent. Then Mexican Americans. Outsiders called us beaners, taco benders, wetbacks, Mexicans, Latins, Hispanics. We were exiles who never left home. With the civil rights movement, the movimiento of the 60s and 70s, we became La Raza Unida, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanoa, and we harkened back. The word Chicano itself was said to be derived from the term Mexica or Mexicanos, Chicano, Chicanx, Chicanx with 2 X's, and then more recently Chicane and Chicane. So deepening the journey of self-inquiry, the Nahuatl X, pronounced shish, was embraced to broaden that affirmation of ancestral origins, making Chicano and more recently Chicanx and Chicanx, and the further rifts of the mestizo now, this Chicane and Chicane. Malcolm Little said he adopted the X to signify the names taken away from him, taken away from his slave ancestors. The Chican X was meant to acknowledge ancestors to whom our connection had been lost, erased, denied any legitimacy. It was meant to signify neutrality of gender and sexuality, along with more recent Chicane. Chicanx folks were welcome, encouraged, required to embrace the cultural heritages of ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, Central Europe, or England as the true and incontrovertible sources of our Western selves. But any reach toward the ancient Mesoamerican world was a romantic fantasy, inauthentic and insignificant, even to our self-same mestizo selves. So interrogating ancestry and identity as a liberatory act, renaming, in the long aftermath of becoming a subaltern American minority, has always been implicit in this chronicle of terms. we might see this admittedly delirious and perhaps somewhat enigmatic willy-nilly litany of descriptors as artifacts of ancestral inquiry, a sequence of ways we've sought to embody, capture, encapsulate core testimonios about who we are, even if they were always intended to represent insurgent assertions of something known, or at least averred. They were always also fitful improvisations, appropriate for yesterday's discussion, striving to reach further plateaus of self-understanding on shifting ground. And so they continue to be, which is a good thing, I think. The shiftingness is a good thing. The cascading litany is in part generational. The Mexican poet, diplomat, Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz, he didn't care much for pachucos. There we go. There we go. Yeah, it goes to the machine. So he wasn't very fond of pachucos. In his essay, The Pachuco and Other Extremes, he wrote, "The purpose of his grotesque dandyism and anarchic behavior is not so much to point out the injustice and incapacity of a society that has failed to assimilate him as it is to demonstrate his personal will to remain different." Here we have the Pachuco period of Cesar Chavez's early journey. My parents, born in the teens and 20s of the 20th century, hated the term Chicano. They'd grown up with Spanish Americans, Latins, Americans of Mexican descent, and they preferred Mexican Americans to describe themselves. Now, with Chicano, there was another term no one quite knew anything about. Did it refer to chicanery, they wondered. Along with others of their generation, they had no use for neologisms relating to their Mexican ancestry. But they did take me and my brothers to Mexico City in 1976, where visiting the Museo Antropológico in Teotihuacan and Tula, I had what Profe Carrasco would aptly call my Aztec moment, as he's written about his Aztec moment. All this grandeur and vision never taught to me in a single lesson in Texas public schools. And there were other long-used terms, raza, el pueblo, mi gente, signifying my race, the people, my people, seem to reach deeper than any superficial descriptors, and they remain in usage. And so do many of these past names. But the idea of a new identity, Chicano, seems superfluous to my mother and father. I'm more of all of the above option, the platform neutrality position, or platform promiscuity even. Transformations are thrilling. But before kind of getting into addressing the enigma of such a litany, how might we situate these descriptors in the context of our deep ancestry in Mexico? In Serge Brzezinski's Mestizo Mind, he points out that one of the big bestsellers in the post-conquest period, 80 years after conquest, was Ovid's Metamorphoses. It begins with, let me tell you how bodies become new bodies. Old bodies become new bodies. And there was something about that narrative that Mexicanos got, this idea of transformation within embodied forms. Gods becoming human, humans becoming animals, animals becoming human. In some respects, the litany of names bears echoes, though, of an earlier improvisational riff on identity that had emerged in colonial New Spain, speaking here about the obsession with genealogy that emerged in the aftermath of the conquest, and the sistema de castas. Maybe as many as, I don't know, kind of a conclusive count, but up to 90 some riffs, algorithms, renderings of what you get when you mix what with what. The Españoles couldn't control the delirious mixing that was taking place, some of it sexual violence, some of it, we must imagine, love is in the mix as well. They didn't know how to contain it, to police it. So the second best option was to create a taxonomy, to create a kind of a vast bingo card of this operating biological algorithm. And so we know that this was intended to produce a kind of system that officialized exclusion. It officialized supremacy. This paradigmatic Español y India produce mestizo was soon joined by delirious production of all of these variations. Negro con mulato produce sambo. De español y mulata produce morisca. De español y morisca produce albinos. In this case, albina. The idea that somehow African heritage produced this albinism. And this is kind of interesting one here in the detail. The dad with the pre-rolls and the gun here nearby. There is this precedent for a Mexicano obsession with naming that which emerges out of historical time in the way that we mix, meet, and mingle each other's traditions. This one, mestizo con mulato atorna atrás. The mix is a kind of a leap backwards of the mestiza and the mulatto. And you know that system of castas got more and more baroque and cartoonish. This one is Español y Negra nace mulata, but in this case, there's kind of a domestic violence underway in this depiction. This is sort of from the later period of the castas in the early 19th century, spanning almost 150 years. And a lot of the kind of the backdrop of this story is kind of laid out in a book that I use a lot in classes. Antonello Garbi's The Dispute of the New World, the history of a polemic. And he's really examining the way that the race science that was the buttressing scaffold of this Spanish system kind of emerged out of Central Europe and Enlightenment thought. So what happened in terms of the legacy of the Sistema de Castas? Developed and implemented as this system of classification and officialization of exclusion and supremacy. What would be its destiny in terms of this story of those questing for self-knowledge, self-understanding? So I always go to the story of Hermenegildo Bustos. There's some Bustos fans, any Bustos fans here? A fantastic self-taught Oaxaqueño painter. This is his rather grim self-portrait from 1891. Bustos painted Campos Santos, or he painted the Santos that are found in many churches in Mexico. They were found in churches in San Antonio until the Archdiocese began to crack down on including them in the displays, like in San Fernando Cathedral, downtown San Antonio, depicting, gratitude for some intercession of a saint or other figure in personal affairs of individuals who would then commission these paintings. And Bustos would listen to these stories, depict them, represent them in the writing, and then do these marvelous renderings of the people themselves. And he began to get torn, to kind of morph the castas formula started to mess with the underlying algorithm and started depicting mestizo peoples without the classification gloss. In some cases, literally depicting kind of the nuclear triad of the sistema de castas. He had an enormous impact on a host of Mexican artists, including Orozco in this depiction of indigenous women. They're looking away from the viewer. Their gaze is guarded, their gaze is kept to themselves in their own position and place. And other Mexicano artists, Abraham and Angel, and it's a contemporary artist, actually an artist who just died last year, a friend in San Antonio, Angel Rodriguez Diaz, a Puerto Riqueño who moved to San Antonio about 25 years ago, called himself a border Rican. And he sort of advanced this program of very realist-based practice. I would tell him he was the reincarnation of Velázquez. That Velázquez wanted to reincarnate and have a party life, and that Angel was the instrument for that to happen. So, you know, at root, what we're talking about here is a knowledge tradition to which we have only very attenuated contact through some of these artifacts. Through our family traditions. And so, you know, in San Antonio, among many colleagues, there's great pride around colleagues at the University of Texas San Antonio who have proudly displayed in their doors, I'm first gen. You know, and we share the pride. And I'm first gen on my dad's side, on my paternal lineage. On my maternal lineage, I'm maybe, I don't know, 5th or 6th gen. Leandra Vela Lopez left Laredo probably sometime around 1885 to go to Huntsville, Texas to get her teaching degree, accompanied by her sister Fermina and Alvina. I don't know if there are any Moriscos in our family, but you know, we did have an Alvina in our family. So they represent this other presence of a knowledge tradition that was still alive in South Texas, in Rio Grande Valley, in parts of Nuevo León, in Tamaulipas, an historic area for where Fermina and Leandra's families had first settled in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century. After having been in northern Mexico in Ceralgo near Monterrey, probably around 1620. So they had already dwelt some time in the northern distant reaches of New Spain, likely Jewish descendants or descendants of Jews who were either conversos or wanted to get as far from the Inquisition as possible. So many of them made their way to places like Ceralgo near Monterrey, a very old colonial settlement in northern Mexico. So these knowledge traditions were impacted by the circumstance of becoming an American minority. The idea that these two Mexicanas from Laredo, teachers, and then begin to teach. My grandmother is here, teaching in Cotula in 1909. Another Juanita. So they were part of this legacy of knowledge, cultura, familia, that had made its way into this distant outpost of colonial New Spain, the borderlands, what would become the borderlands. And they were borderlands even before there was a border, in that they were at the fronteriza, end of the colonial New Spain project, a project that really was undertaken for settlement in the mid 1700s, so fully 200 years after the conquest. 2 centuries passed before they dared make their way into the tierras salvajes, tierra de los infieles, the tierra de los chichimecas. So when you think about the borderlands in the context of a borderlands humanities, we think about these places of origin and setting out, and this motif that's deeply echoed in ancient Mesoamerican narratives relating to setting out from this place of origin. Chico Mostoc in the Chichimeca tradition, Aslan in the Nahua tradition. And the depictions always around the idea of 7 caves, a very watery place from which these ancestors set out on this journey. And often the journey from the north into the south. So in San Antonio, there are a lot of caves in San Antonio, and at least back in the ancient times, it was a place of abundant water. The San Pedro Creek and the springs in downtown San Antonio were just incredibly rich and full of streams, and in fact, that was where the city was founded. So there is this kind of echo from the indigenous world of this motif of setting out from a distant place towards some new center, and vice versa, setting out from the center to the periphery. So, for an expanded sense of the meaning of borderlands in this case, we're really talking about the dispossessed lands of former colonial New Spain, Mexico. So borderlands extending to Northern California and to Colorado and Lubbock, and an expanded matrix of borderlands identities, even though the concentration remains in South Texas and along the closer borderland settings. So I mentioned, these settling expeditions that were made out of Querétaro in the 1740s that were undertaken to create colonias, and many still exist. This is the Rio Grande here. This is a 1792 reproduction of a mapa that was the record of the expeditions. So see here, for instance, this little town here, Revilla, on the Rio Grande, was founded by some of my maternal grandmother's ancestors. And so these were expeditions that were undertaken by José Escandón. He aspired to be a conquistador, but it was 200 years too late. So he was brought up on charges, and he dies basically on trial for not having properly evangelized, and then some alleged misappropriation of funds. But a lot of these expeditions, and maybe about a cluster of 15 settlements still exist, including Laredo. So Escandón is the founder of town of Laredo. That's why it's called Nuevo Laredo, on the southern side of the Rio. So when the partition happened, the Mexicanos moved to Nuevo Laredo. So Escandón, in a sense, seeded in this period the cultura that would emerge, this profound community that would emerge in the Rio Grande Valley. And maybe the capital there being not Laredo, but Brownsville. So right at the tip of Texas. So borderland studies as a practice in this narrative, 2 exemplars that I want to point out. One, Herbert Eugene Bolton, who's got an interesting kind of path as a scholar out of California, a student of Frederick Jackson Turner, he of the lauded essay, The Closing of the American Frontier. And Bolton becomes teacher to Americo Paredes from Brownsville. And Paredes is this borderlands polymath of sorts, a singer, a songwriter, a folklorist, an anthropologist. His book, With His Pistol in His Hand, A Border Ballad and Its Hero, the story of the corrido of Gregorio Cortés. It's made into a film, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortés, the film made by Robert Young, who also made Alambrista, that referred to a minute ago. But it's a remarkable book, 1959, and he's the first Mexican American, not yet Chicano, maybe not even yet Mexican American, but he's the first Mexicano born in the United States to get a PhD at UT Austin. Carlos Castañeda, not the shaman, but the historian, who was, his sister was Don Americo's teacher in Brownsville. So these families were clustered and knew each other. Carlos Castañeda was the first Mexicano to get a PhD. So there's a big Porlote in San Antonio or in Texas, you know. Is it Castañeda or is it Paredes who got the first PhD? Well, you know, Paredes was born in the United States. That's the differentiation. Castañeda born in Tamaulipas. But this is a remarkable book. If you've not read this book, I highly commend it in that it is a self-created amalgam of folklore, oral history, family memoria, anthropology. So Paredes knew that he needed to create a new kind of almost nomadic scholarship to tell the story about the ballad of Gregorio Cortés, this kind of Rio Grande Valley folk hero who eludes the Texas Rangers on kind of a notorious fugitives run for an injustice that he's been accused of. And it's a period, an important period in terms of the larger narrative of what was transpiring in these lands, in these tierras fronterizas, in that it takes place during this period that's referred to as the Hora de Sangre or the La Matanza, a period between 1905 and 1920 when as many as 5,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans are either extrajudicially murdered or lynched. This is the work that's been so important in the last years, done by the Refusing to Forget historians. Ben Johnson and John Gonzalez and Mr. The anti-Mexican Monica. So Monica Muñoz Martinez. A really important work that's been done on this story in the last year. So this is a kind of an important backstory to understanding the way that the borderlands as a space affects these questions of these shifting descriptors of identity. A landscape in which, in Mary Louise Pratt's terms, constitute these contact zones, places of contact and interaction, and Virgilio's idea of the borderlands as life where cultures meet. So this place of friction and reciprocity, of violence and accords, a profound setting in terms of a human story, a deep human story that underlies the American minority status. Can we get to that deeper level of borderlands as a place of human meaning, production and emergence of human meaning? You know, in a course I'm doing right now on Latin American civilization, just in terms of random selection of students coming up in this course, one Chicanx student who is also descended from Guarani indigenous people. So Guarani Chicanese. Another who is descended from Trinidad Tobago slave ancestry, a proud Blaxican, as he calls himself. Another who is Puerto Riqueño Chicano, who is descended from a family that included a Puerto Rican militant who tried to assassinate Harry Truman. So this is just, you know, the census of one course at University of Texas San Antonio. But it's typical of the crossroads that are constituted in the borderlands. So another aspect of the story in terms of this borderland space and the kind of creativity and invention that it can facilitate, produce, maybe manifest. And here, talking about the shaman Carlos Castaneda, not the historian, we dropped the tilde, and Gloria Anzaldúa. So both figures, you know, you can't really get through UTSA without going through Gloria Anzaldúa. She's sort of become a fixture, a centerpiece to many colleagues teaching about these histories. And Carlos Castaneda, as we know, in terms of his narratives, set in Arizona and various parts of Mexico, an exemplar for me of someone setting out to inquire into the complexity of origins of the people of the border clans. And in this case, both performing this drama of the mestizo mind, embracing or opting for this indigenous cosmovision. You know, and the Castaneda epic for me is, you know, is important to read in that sense. That's important for me to sort out the veracity. As a work of invention, it's a dramatic turn in the American imaginary. The idea of a mestizo individual embracing this indigenous origin. And similarly with Anzaldúa. So the drama that this represents in terms of a turn in understanding of ourselves, part of a borderlands humanities that suggests some horizons of chicanidades, where things are going, because we're very much en medias res in this story. And in terms of the litany that we looked at earlier, that's really the span of 80 years, maybe 80 years, 100 years at most, perhaps. So to get at this borderlands humanities, we think about, you know, what kinds of chronicles are going to be required and how they have emerged out of some of the sources of these chicanidades, of Mexican Americanness. You know, the Paco, I Am Joaquin, Gonzalez's poem, I Am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the world of gringo society, confused by the rules, scorned by attitudes, suppressed by manipulation, and destroyed by modern society. You know, so this is very much, it marks a time, a very powerful time of insurgent imagination, taking issue with the way the community has been treated, but very much defined by this polarity. You know, against that kind of model of the Gastas period, defined by the external scriptures. So, you know, in the last 30 years, we've had a series of epochal exhibitions that I think have helped to begin to build some of the interiority, some of the inwardness that nourishes new ways of understanding ourselves. I'm pointing to a few here. One that Rafa was integral in making possible in Denver. Was it Denver Art Museum? Museum of Natural History. The Museum of Natural History, Mocosuma's Mexico, the Metropolitan's Mexico Splendors of 30 Centuries. this extraordinary show that was in SAMA, the San Antonio Museum of Art, of Santos, 2,000 years of Latin American portraiture, going from the moche ceramics to contemporary artists like Angel Rodriguez Diaz. Ilona Katsu's show, Inventing Race at LACMA. The best show I've ever seen dealing with the Castas tradition, really getting into cracking the code of the Castas. You know, she established basically that there was this kind of underlying calculus. You know, once Spanish blood was made impure, it would take 3 generations of going back to the well of a Spanish ancestry before you could be fully cleansed of the impurities of the Africano or the Indígena. Another great show at SAMA, the San Antonio 1718 show, which really anatomized the way that there was this field of reciprocity between Querétaro and San Antonio, particularly in terms of building the missions in San Antonio. And then the more recent show from the Denver Art Museum on the legacy of Malinche. So this is sort of come on, these are all shows. I didn't get a chance to see Motezuma's Mexico, but all these other shows, I got the wrong. So, but all these other shows were really important, just markers of a new way of becoming engaged with some of these stories visually, and in many cases through this these artistic artifacts. But alongside what was going on in terms of museological business, we were also seeing this burgeoning of new scholarship about the ancient Mesoamerican past. And in another talk from last year, I talked a lot about the way that Los Carrasco's work was a turning point for me in the 90s, in the early 90s, with the book Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, and particularly this chapter on the journey from storybook to encyclopedia. The demonstration of the complex literacies of the ancient Mesoamerican world. Again, something that had never been broached in any class I ever took in Texas public schools. And I read a lot of Edmund Spencer and Sir Thomas Browne before I ever knew about the Florentine Codex. So, you know, and then, you know, in the last years, along with Reed and with Scott, you know, the extraordinary focus on the storybook of the Mapa de Cuauhtémoc, which I bet y'all have heard something about along the way in many discussions here. You know, a kind of an encapsulation of this epic from which we had been disconnected. An epic of migration and mestizaje, the migration out of Chico Mostoc, the long perilous journey to and through Cholula, and then founding the new home in Cuauhtémoc. So a document that establishes in deep time already this continuity of migration and mestizaje, and new becoming. And that you got to get on the road to become something new. You got to take some risks. Some very bad shit is going to go down. So what we see in the border taking place today is part of this lineage of stories. And then the Florentine Codex, in terms of not just the encyclopedic assemblage that it represents, but more recently, and I was really bummed to miss Scott and David this week in their study of this new project coming through the Getty Center, the digital version of the Florentine Codex, allowing unlimited access to this, you know, paradigmatic document of what we're talking about, a document that has alongside itself pictographic Espanol and Nahuatl literacies. Again, like the Paredes book, Sahagún had to invent this. And even with all the sermonizing that Sahagún brings to the project, it nonetheless provides this extraordinary record, this memoria of the knowledge tradition that would be lost. So, you know, the work that David has done has really been important in my journey into these narratives. Most recently, over the last 10 years or so, following the excavation of the tunnel at Teotihuacan, the Proyecto Tlalocan, the tunnel that goes from the middle of the ancient Ciudadela Plaza to the center of the underground, the very epicenter of the Twin Serpent Temple in the Ciudadela. And you know, so with these journeys to Mexico, we've been able to follow the excavation and discovery of this extraordinary trove of artifacts, the presence of the sort of air of ritual, of ancient ritual, and then the last visit of the revelation that in fact the tunnel preceded the temple. It was thought before that maybe the temple was built, the pyramid was built, and that the tunnel followed that, but now apparently the archaeologists believe it was the reverse, that it began with the tunnel. And this is the end of the tunnel here, where they found this kind of arrangement of these stone effigies of these ancestral presences. And the gaze, again, you know, this ancient gaze into the now. So for me, over these years, visiting that site with Mr. Carrasco and a host of other folks from this community and all over the country, joining colleagues in Mexico, this kind of coalition that has been so pivotal in making possible a new way of connecting to this ancient source. And, you know, alongside the great temple in Mexico, Templo Mayor, the excavation that's ongoing there. And for me, it's become particularly evocative, fascinating. How do we go from the tunnel to the scale of the Templo Mayor, the scale of Teotihuacan? How do we go from this intimate space underground to the monumental spaces that would emerge as the sort of stages for the demonstration of this new cosmovision? That's a story I'm really interested in. So pivotal in this story, of course, is the dynamic duo of Matos Moctezuma and his profe. Incredible stories about how that took place, their meeting, and the extraordinary cascading fruits that would follow of this partnership, bringing a host of scholars, wayward writers, filmmakers together to embody these connections again, find ways to make them live again in new forms, the metamorphoses. So if you think about Jorge Gonzalez, very much the sort of the screed against oppression, we get new kinds of expressions possible. I just wanted to share one. J. Michael Martinez, a Colorado poet. This is from a poem in his book, Heredities, The Articulations of Quetzalcoatl's Spine. The two lateral occipido-atlantal ligaments are strong, fibrous bands offering maize and amaranth to the body which praises the human face. These ligaments are directed obliquely upward and inward, attached to the souls of infants transformed into hummingbirds, below to the base of the black hair attached to their mother, the first woman. Chicanidad is evolving. You know, between Jorge Gonzalez, another Colorado poet, and brother J. Michael, extraordinary testimony to this evolution. I just want to end some last thoughts about how this gets situated in terms of a learning practice, and you know what it might mean to think about being able to share these experiences, for instance, in Mexico, with students at UTSA who don't know these stories. They don't know these sites. Like me before 1976. So going back to the Chicanx, my preferred X is photo 51. Does anybody know what photo 51 is? I don't know area 51. I didn't. Yeah. So there's always something always spooky about 51. Photo 51 is Rosalind Franklin's photograph taken through X-ray crystallographic process. This is from the late 40s of the DNA molecule. And it's rendered, it's sort of an overhead shot of the DNA molecule. And in this rendering, it becomes an X. So for me, the Chican X is the Rosalind Franklin X, is the genetic print that encompasses the totality of our migrations and mestizaje, the emergence out of Africa, the journeys through the Mediterranean, through Iberia, into Mexico. So in our case, but in terms of the human story, the fact that we are all mestizos. And if we're all mestizos, then no borders are legitimate, a new human ethic. There are changes that are coming now in the ethnic and racial reporting of the next American census that will allow you to report as many sources of your ancestry as you choose. Before it was usually black or white. Then you could choose indigenous, you could choose very limited in scope. Now it's really encouraging you to represent the totality of who you are. The fact that the census is led by my primo hermano, Robert Santos, is just a coincidence. We've only always talked about this. And I'm really proud that we brought this mestizo lens to the American census. So again, we're in this in medias res status, but very much with the anticipation of what is yet to come. This global lens on the global X of the genetic imprint also takes us to the global nature of the borderlands as a space and the global refractions of chicanidades. In this case, a BBC Mundo project, Los Muros que no han caído, a project short-lived that I'd like to revive. I've made a proposal to the Carnegie Foundation to revive this ongoing reporting project on the contested borders around the world, like the United States, Palestine, Northern Ireland, Korea, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, etc. So some of it's archived on the web, but the project is no longer extant. So a global lens on chicanidades. And then maybe even an extraterrestrial lens, kind of it's a colleague of mine in San Antonio, a conspirator named Joaquin Huerte, Walking Dead, Joaquin Huerte. This is his extraordinary podcast. I encourage you to dive into it. Chicanx versus aliens. And it's essentially a kind of oral history podcast relating to Chicanos, Chicanas, experiencing the extraordinary in South Texas. So, not just aliens. I asked one of my students, Valita Rodriguez, who's working on a novel about what historical novel set in the 5 years after the conquest. This was her note on Chicanx. X degenders the term, making more comfortable for queer, Chicano, X folks. By putting the X both at the beginning and the end, we're acknowledging queerness both at the onset of our mixed origins and in the current day. So the X's is bookends. It's finally challenging the notion that queerness is anything new. So for me, the question of this litany and the enigma of the litany is really a signifier of the fact that we're really orienting our inquiry towards are these interrupted epics. How do we return to the epic of our humanity in deep time, that means really going into the millennia of migrations in Mestizaje, so well beyond Mexico. And then this understanding of ourselves in this kind of as a protean improvisational quantities, subjectivities, which I think would have annoyed a lot of early Chicano activists, this idea that any of this was improvisational or protean. I recently saw this incredible documentary on Carlos Santana, which I haven't seen it anywhere but on United, tiny screens in United. But Carlos Santana has this great statement in there. It says, maybe I'm a multi-dimensional Mexican. I should be able to serve the cosmos with my imagination. Serving the cosmos. I don't know what that's called. That's what I want to be. Cosmicano. So I'm going to leave it there and we can have a chat. Thanks, y'all.
So we'll open this dialogue. I'm sure there's some of my students have questions. Anyone here? So
It's contestation. Appreciate it.
I have more of a reaction. Thank you so much. It's a lot to think with. And I'm thinking about the relationship between the castas or the system of castas and the ex. I mean, thinking about the castas being also such a the idea of religious purity being really at the heart of it. And that's why the Moriscos comes as part of it, and the Inquisition being part of the process of creating this sense of a pure Cristiano through the policing of the mixture. And that on the one hand, and on the other hand, this question of the ex that almost blows it all up. In the sense of both, I like both the reference to the past ancestry, while at the same time leaves the future. Right? So contrary to the castas, which was always the attempt to predict what will be the outcome, what are the allowed mixtures and all of that. The X seems to open up toward the future yet to be discovered. I like that contrast with the castas. All more powerful.
I mean, so many of the turns in the story are fitful in nature. You know, in the way that they are performed when we look at the text, like, you know, say Las Gonzalez's Plaza Cosmica, you know, kind of written with all kinds of, you know, craziness and obsession and rooted in esoteric philosophy, but is striving towards some new understanding, you know, reversing or seeking to reverse the polarities of the Sistema de Castas. There was this novel in the late 90s, La Mujer Dormida Debe Dar a Luz. Anybody knows this? It was a kind of pulpy bestseller, and it had to do with the story of the novel told the story of a Nazi affiliate, not a committed Nazi, but somebody who had been sent by Hitler to study Tibetan Buddhism he goes and spends 7 years meditating in a cave, and he has this revelation. And he then goes to Mexico, and he then trains this Mexicano, an initiate, and the Mexicano goes to Tibet and becomes a monk. And he has this revelation that the next great human civilizational manifestation is going to come from Mexico. And so, like Vasconcelos, and then this strange novel, end of the 90s, had the same obsession that something distinctive, monumental, redefining humanity was going to emerge out of this story of Mexico. Or the Ragdoll Diaries by the Chicano science fiction novelist. His name's Remaking. In that one, there's this plague that can only be addressed by finding blood that has Aztec components to it. So there's kind of this, underlying crypto messianism about some of this, and it was certainly part of the Chicano movement, the Movimiento period.
And I wonder if it could be disentangled from the idea of the
blood.
I mean, I work a lot with Caribbean materials, and one of the arguments that rather than thinking the transformation, the metamorphosis of the identity in terms of blood as the castas represented, that thinking in terms of cultural convention allows us to avoid some of the problems that Vasconcelos had by thinking the future as the elimination of indigent populations.
Yeah. I came up last night with talk with dinner, Patricia JPSantosLRA4s, talking about it in terms of specifically, this underlying project of suppression and erasure of African and indigenous epistemology. And that is a component of mestizophilia that emerges from that kind of Vasconcelos moment. It's kind of a new romanticism relating to things mestizo. The genetic side of the story, this is kind of a codex of its own. The idea that each of us carries this exhaustive record of our ancestral origins, and it's time coded, and that we're in the beginning of our literacy around it. So we're really in the first microseconds after the inception of this idea. A new way of understanding ancestral origins, and it's not a line, despite what Professor Gates does in those Finding Your Roots. It's not like establishing this line. The farther back you go in time, it's more like a fractal. It's a more broad spectrum ancestral scope of reference. There's fantastic, another film I just saw on a flight somewhere, the film Origin. Do you know this film Origin? The film about Isabel Wilkerson writing the book on caste, and so she's in that book, she's saying, the African-American struggle is in part kindred to all of these folks who struggle with castes. And so she specifically is looking at the African-American story alongside Jews and the rise of Nazi Germany and the Dalits and the untouchables in India. So this film is kind of you don't see this too often, a film about a scholar doing research. And then the disputes she encounters along the way, for many African Americans as well, that it's more about caste than race, creating these structures and these kind of taxonomies of exclusion. Very much not what's going on in Texas these days. We are in the midst of, literally in terms of the University of Texas system, we have all been forced to dismantle all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. The offices have been dissolved. Staffs have been reassigned. Something Kafkaesque or, Soviet era audacity about it. And the scary thing is that it's happened almost imperceptibly, and nobody really talks about it. If you ask questions, it's a very nervous exchange. They seek not to name what's taking place. And in terms of the way it's playing out in Texas, not only the prescription of all of these efforts, but an audit on the prescription. So they're going to go in and make sure you haven't just put lipstick on a pig. You haven't repackaged it under some other tag. So most places are choosing to completely dismantle.
Yeah, I was very fascinated by your presentation, specifically how you were saying that racial science was very much project or the Enlightenment influenced, like 19th century Mexico, and I feel like Vasconcelos was very much, it was also like indirectly influenced by Enlightenment ideals of freedom and liberty, right? So I really like this whole tracing because I'm also fascinated by all these ideas that you're doing, like sort of moving across archives, right, traditions or narratives, right? Specifically, Americo Paredes is thinking of a greater Mexico, right? So at the end, you end up with this very interesting, fascinating idea of a global lens of Chicanidades. I mean, I'm wondering if you can, I'm curious if you can comment about how are you deploying this global lens? Is it a method, an identity? Is it a reading practice? Because you're also reading Sagun. Sagun is also like creating a forced translation, for example, of indigenous identities or indigenous practices, right? So is it a method, an identity, a reading practice? I'm kind of seeing it like a borderless thinking, right? And at what point is this also an exclusionary reading method or reading practice?
Thank you. During this period of making these documentaries, like between 1984 and 1992, a lot of documentaries dealing with liberation theology, with new Muslim communities emerging, like Sudan and Turkey. And, in that period, one of the things that really struck me, this is something that kind of worked against the grain for me, because I was essentially incurious about the world. But I really felt like South Texas pretty much mapped the cosmos for me. So these occasions to kind of get out in the world were always unexpected, either to study abroad or then undertaking these trips and going to places like Palestine and seeing the kindredness of the experience of Palestinos in the border wall and in Bethlehem and the West Bank with experiences in South Texas, what was beginning to emerge in terms of this militarization and and then reporting in the Contra War in Central America, essentially witnessing that and seeing almost no difference between the people I grew up with and the people I met in Central America. This invisible polity, something that has never been kind of manifested in any way in education, in terms of what we were taught. So it kind of built on something journalistic about this. Like there was a period where there was this non-aligned movement, a global non-aligned movement. You know, the Bandung Declaration, this period in the 50s, where there were coalitions of people outside the machine, vanquished and dismantled, as liberation theology was. You know, something that I saw, somebody who was to Notre Dame as an undergrad, so when I came out of university, I was about as anti-religious as you could possibly be. Like my experience at Notre Dame, in terms of that whole phenomenon there. And, you know, if we were Catholic in San Antonio, we were sort of Aztec Catholic or Rosicrucian Catholic or amalgam of both. But what I saw, you know, as a reporter in places like Nicaragua, Peru, Brazil, you know, was extraordinary to see the way that community and faith marshaled through new readings of this gospel tradition were transforming societies, and then watched it be dismantled. I went in really like the last summer of 1988, when Ratzinger published his kind of preachings on liberation theology, and then proceeded to kind of cut down a lot of his prize students, including Leonardo Bach. So that was sort of the ground for thinking about the possibility of this coalition between Chicanx communities and these other kindred struggles around the world. You know, during the period of Raza Unida, the Raza Unida party that emerged in Texas in the 70s, late 60s and into the 70s, there was a one faction of that effort that was a kind of internationalist, trying to build coalitions in Mexico and in Cuba, in Chile, but also incarcerated, detoured into prisons, and collapsing as an effort. You know, so these are stories that kind of get rebooted, it seems, almost every generation. Are there prospects now for new ways of convening these kinds of community? These new kinds of mutualities? I wonder. What do you mean in terms of exclusion?
No, I'm thinking because at some points, all these new lenses or new theories or reading methods, for some thinking of queer studies or queer theory, has become sort of like a hegemonic and exclusionary reading method or field, even Latin studies, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking at what point is it's exclusionary. But I definitely agree that this is a can be a coalition of solidarity making kind of process based on the shared experiences of harm.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think in that movie, the origin movie, you see how Isabel Wilkerson, she was the one who wrote Warmth of Other Suns, about the migrations out of the South into the industrial North in Chicago and New York and England. And the resistance that she encounters in terms of trying to locate the edge of the struggle in this kind of caste context rather than a racial one. I haven't read the book yet, but the movie tells the story.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. I really liked how you explained kind of like the genealogy and the place of origin. And it's almost integrated into our DNA. It's not just a migratory pattern that we see. And then eventually kind of revealing this aspect that we have whenever we are kind of looking to reconnect with history and memories and kind of documenting that. But I was wondering if I think, is it leading us to us becoming something, transforming us into something different, or finding our original place of belonging? Or is this more an extension of the different cosmos? is more an extension of a cosmic tunnel, that we are in a different cosmic plane, and that's kind of our extension of our own cosmological this journey that we are that started probably in China, but now it's over, across the border.
Yeah, I mean, that is the essence of the mystery right there.
In your worldview or perception, where is it leading you?
You know, in the borderlands now, I'm interested in the role that arts and humanities agents are playing in this story. You know, so contrasted with the preponderant focus on economy or you know, the political context of immigration. You know, there's kind of a presence of this continuity of migration certainly in our community in San Antonio. You know, most families have some connection either to the Escandon stories or migration out of Mexico during the period of revolution, or more recent struggles that precipitated journeys north. Scholars have shown that much of that migration is circular. So many people go back and circulate. So that's another part of this continuity. But you know, from the trajectory from that storybook of the Mapa de Quaquinchan, we have this assertion of a kind of sacred obligation around migration. It's something sacred that transpires on the perilous road. And so it's not something that's just kind of elective and privileged in its nature. It's something that often involves dire circumstances. So that kind of begins to build out the story that were otherwise reported, you know, for instance, regarding the border buoys in the Rio Grande, the border buoys that Governor Abbott has put in the river, and a new heightened border, and with all these more perilous qualities of circular saws between buoys. And it's an instrument created by a South African company that specializes in perilous boundaries. And they've worked on the wall in Palestine. So underneath all of this political and historical perturbation that's so evident for us in the news, there's this deeper human story. And right now, one of the things that's kind of anathematized is one worlders, city of one world. So the idea of open borders, the ultimate insult or tarring of a politician. So there's been an effective effort to kind of cauterize that road. That road. There's an architect, Rafael. He's created these instruments, these kind of hack projects to build seesaws in the border wall. So you've seen this, where he's created a kit that allows you to kind of create, a seesaw on the border wall. Whimsical, but at a deeper level, a human intervention in terms of the regime that was to project this inviolability. One of many such artists and agents, one project in a Mexicano artist created a project in El Paso that connected a plaza in El Paso with a plaza in Juarez, connecting these two microphones and speakers. So people could speak to each other and send these light signals. You seen that project? Yeah. So that represents for me this other road, the possibility of another way of addressing these narratives, in real time, in historical space, in this geographic setting of the borderlands.
Yeah, I think it's
more, it's like a preoccupation that I had listening to you, and I want to know if you share it. But it seems to me like this spirit of the Chicanidad as a unity, I don't think it's happening that like in South America. Yeah, like and maybe like the clearest example for me are like the Venezuelan migration in the continent. But you can see it also like with the Asian migration, people from Haiti, migration to Chile, and Brazil, and you see the exclusionary response to those migration, like South-South migration. And then, like I hear this story that for me it's very inspiring. But I wonder, why is it the case that even among ourselves, we don't have that spirit? Yeah. Yeah, something that's the central question of this term is, the contrasting civilizational manifestations within the hemisphere, in Latin America and in the United States. How do we account for this set in the cycle of oligarchic rule and military rule that becomes the constant in the Latin American context, and then the inattention on the American side, for instance, just what's happening in Haiti right now, extraordinary horror that's taking place, slow motion daily, and yet no alarms, no sense of conscience ignited in response. We've seen periods where there was evidence of different ways that people were taking new visions. Sandinista movement, Allende movement, but always effectively suppressed, and then return to this pattern of extraction of wealth, oligarchic and military rule, despotismo, capitalismo. How do we account for that? Where is the way out? In terms of borderlands in South Texas, it means in terms of the rise of narco-cultura in Mexico, particularly in North Mexico. I haven't visited Coahuila, where my father's family comes from, in 20 years. And there were some occasions researching last book in Tamaulipas where, I realized that I was in peril. It's just doing things that I'd done without a second thought. Writing the first book, nothing finished. Being able to go to Mexico City, rent a VW bug, and then just go anywhere every day without any plan for where you're going to end up the other day, knowing fully that you're going to find some welfare. It's not feasible right now. So how the Mexico, Canada, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, what's the ground of the possibility of civil society in those nations? You don't see it right now. No. I mean, I currently no, but I think it's a work that needs to happen and that I am inspired to be part of. I do see some possibility for sure, and maybe my account was pessimistic because it's not true that the response has been uniquely negative to the migration. And actually no, at the beginning it was very positive for the Venezuelan migration in Colombia. Mostly in Colombia, the response of the Colombian society to the Venezuelan migration was outstanding. And that made me feel, and Colombia is I lived 10 years there and gave me everything. But then, there's this class division that then there's certain migrants that we don't. Oh, and then there's this whole like, oh, you're one of the good ones. And I'm like, wow. I don't know how I feel about that. And of course, it's related, this classismo with how we perceive each other. But I do think there are ways out. Like maybe I know we're out of time. Maybe I think about the role of institutions, religious institutions, in promoting that. Maybe that's one of the avenues. Art, literature, culture.
It's something we're thinking a lot about in building this program. That the opportunities for our students to experience those places firsthand, to travel to many, but travel to other parts of Latin America. It's still uncommon to encounter globalized Chicanos, globalized Chicanx folks. We knew two of the precursors of this way forward, Virgilio Elizondo and Tomás Ibarra Fausto, both from South Texas. Tomás Ibarra Fausto, an art critic, theorist, longtime Rockefeller Foundation program officer. These were two folks born in the late 20s, early 30s, who had this vision to set out into the world. Virgil truly globally in Asia, and Africa, Latin America, and Tomás Europe and Mexico, Latino America. It's still very uncommon journeys for Mexican American folks to have that view to the world. And I sort of did it inadvertently, not entirely under protest, but it wasn't a plan. It wasn't something that I undertook. So it fell me. So how do we make that number of folks with that experience more ample? That's what we're trying to do, but yeah, there are a lot of reservations about students going to Mexico, other parts of that's land.
So I'm just hopeful though. It's very important to face the reality. I want to thank all of you for coming.
Thanks, y'all. Thank you so much for
Stan, Phillip, for the presentation. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, we have to. Because I think what you're doing, that program that you mentioned, is one of them. Yeah, and important. And we're able to bring people there, down there, down there, there. Yeah, we just need to make the group larger.
Yeah, that's what I said yesterday was something like manifestations of information on the station. Information. It's still just kind of like, way.